Hi, everybody. My name is Anna Beswick. I work as a Climate Adaptation and Resilience Policy Fellow at the London School of Economics, and we're really pleased to be part of the Zurich Climate Resilience Alliance. I want to begin this webinar by sincerely thanking our colleagues at Mercy Corps, particularly Salome, for pulling this event together today and bringing together such an excellent group of presenters for us all to hear from. So a big thank you from the outset for that. I should also let you know today that this webinar is being recorded, just so you're aware for when you maybe come on screen later to ask your questions, that you would be shown on the recording if you have your camera on. So that will be also, the link to the recording will be shared with you after this event so that you can share it with colleagues and contacts who might have liked to join but can't quite make it today. So in terms of the format for our time together, I'll shortly start handing over to our presenters. We have 25 minutes of presentations, so really varied input from our presenters. And we then have 25 minutes for question and answer time. Please do ask your questions and record your questions during the presentation using the Q&A tab on Teams. And you can also look at that Q&A tab and I believe vote up or indicate the questions that you're most interested in. And I will do my very best when we move into the Q&A session to make sure that we get the majority of our questions answered. So why are we here today? Well, with around a month to go until COP30 in Belém, it's crucial that we continue to push for increases in the amount and quality of adaptation finance. We know that climate adaptation is not a nice to have or a choice, and that it's a lifeline for vulnerable communities to protect lives, livelihoods, and build long-term resilience. So, as I mentioned before, I'm delighted to have a really excellent panel join us for this session today, to share important new evidence and insights and to explore how to make progress on finance in the lead up to and at COP30. So first up, we're going to hear from Sarah Columbrander, the Director of Climate and Sustainability Programmes at ODI. Sarah is going to present key findings from ODI's upcoming global report, A Fair Share of Climate Finance, an Assessment of Quantity and Quality. And this report explores which developed countries are paying their fair share of climate finance and assesses the quality of finance. Oh, if I could ask you to mute, please, if you've just joined us. Thank you. Okay, so Sarah, over to you to take the floor for 10 minutes. I'll let you know when that 10 minutes is up to ensure we keep to time. But thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you to all of you for joining today. It's a real pleasure to be here again. I say again because this is the latest in a series of reports that we've undertaken in partnership with the Climate Resilience Alliance and now also with Foundation Chanel, and we're really looking forward to sharing the latest findings with you. Apologies, firstly, to those of you who dialed in the hopes of hearing Letitia Petinotti's dulcet French accent as promoted. She's not very well today, so you're stuck with my Australian twang and subsequently, I know, with Ben's New Zealand accent. So between us, you're getting a strong Antipodean hit, and we do apologise. So today I'm going to be covering two topics, the quantity of international climate finance provided by developed countries to developing countries and the quality of that finance, which is a new addition to our report and something I should say that the Climate Resilience Alliance have long been pushing for, but we've not been in a position to do. I want to start off with a proviso, which is that unfortunately the data for climate finance is produced best case scenario 17 months after the end of the calendar year. So we are going to be presenting 2023 data. The world has changed a lot in that period of time, arguably not for the better. And so I'll also be speaking about the extent to which the findings from 2023 continue to resonate going forward, and really look forward to hearing your questions and seeing any of your comments in the chat around how this is playing out in your particular countries or for your communities. So firstly, let's talk about the quantity of international climate finance provided by developed countries to developing countries. Most of you will know that back in 2009, developed countries committed to provide 100 billion a year to developing countries by 2020. And then subsequently that goal was extended up until 2025. So between 2020 and 2025, that cohort of countries identified back in 1992 when the UN Convention was formed have this annual obligation of 100 billion a year. The problem is that 100 billion a year is just for all developed countries. And as you know, their performance on climate finance, and in fact, their performance on climate more generally, is not always equivalent. We've got some real rock stars and we've got some real laggards. And so a few years ago, ODI and the Climate Resilience Alliance sat down together to basically think through how that 100 billion should be apportioned among those countries. And we came up with 3 metrics. The first is historic responsibility for climate change. How many emissions have those countries produced? Unfortunately, only since 1990, partially because of the quality of the earlier data and partially because we felt that was a credible deadline, with that being the point where there was scientific consensus on the drivers of climate change and therefore a momentum for an incentive for action. Secondly, we've based our allocation of fair share on countries' capacity to pay. How rich are they? What is the size of their economy? And lastly, we've based it on their population. So assuming that once you're a developed country, every person living in those countries has an equal accountability for the 100 billion goal. And as you can see, not all developed countries were created equal. So we come out finding that the US should be accountable for about 44 to 45%, so 44 to 45 billion dollars a year of the current goal, and that by comparison, Iceland is responsible for only 0.04% of the goal. So some big differences, although they're treated in the negotiations as a collective. So how did they do in 2023 in terms of progress to this goal? Next slide, please. There's lots of good news from 2023. We have more countries than ever before who are showing up as providing their fair share, and a shout out to Iceland, New Zealand, and the UK, which for the first time, using our particular metrics, show up as providing their fair share. So that's great to see. Particular credit to those countries in dark green, which are providing at least double their fair share. I'm not going to lie to you, the system is imperfect, as in all things climate finance accounting. For example, Norway there sits at the top of the charts, and we're delighted to see that, but it's hard to forget that it's financed by oil. And France and Japan have also showing up as dark green, but unlike a lot of the countries lower than them in the league table, a very large proportion of their climate finance is provided as loans rather than grants. And so they actually recover a lot of the money that they provide. So this is not a perfect league table, but it's a pretty good league table, and we'd encourage you to use it and reference it. I think the other thing, of course, I've talked about some of the leaders and those that are paying their fair share, but of course it's important to shine a spotlight on those that are falling short. And to be honest, it's always the same suspects. There's a handful of big economies, Canada, Italy, Australia, and Spain, which historically accounted for the gap and now are falling short of their fair share. If you're not on mute, could you be, please? Thank you so much. And then the US, which is the largest provider individually, or second largest provider individually, but because it falls so far short of its fair share, sits down there in the orange category. But a lot has changed in the last nearly 2 years, not least the US's position on international development assistance and climate change. And so let me just jump you over to a quick snapshot of some of the ways in which things are changing since. Next slide, please. So as part of our analysis, we took a look at the countries what countries' aid commitments are going forward. And I just wanted to give a shout out to a few in particular. Denmark, Luxembourg, Norway, and Sweden represent the handful of countries who are already providing their fair share of climate finance and 0.7% of GNI as development assistance, and have not are not planning to fall below that going forward. We see some countries there which are committing to increase their official development assistance and climate finance, even as others cut. Australia and Iceland definitely have written it into their upcoming budgets. I put in a question mark and an exclamation next to Spain and Italy because they They have hinted at it, but it's not quite as robustly written into their public finance planning as it might be for others. Canada and Ireland are holding the line, and a number of countries, Germany, France, Japan, the Netherlands, and others, are cutting aid, but the most dramatic cuts and the most pronounced retreat from the multilateral system has obviously been the US, and I hope you can forgive my use of emojis to illustrate that. With those points made, I want to jump onto the question of quality of climate finance. And I'm about to inflict death by chart on you, so do bear with me for the last 4 minutes of this presentation. So could we move 2 slides along, please, for quality? Thank you so much. So on quality, ODI has basically looked at 4 different metrics. Is the climate finance appropriate? Is it adequate? Is it additional? And to what extent does it also support gender equality? So let me quickly talk through each of those. So we've got a few different metrics for each of them, and I've just pulled out the one that I personally found the most interesting. So on appropriate, we looked at how much developed countries are providing climate finance in the form of loans to those that are considered highly indebted or poor countries. And you'll see we've got a real winner there in France, followed by Italy and Norway. So this goes back to my earlier point about the league table being a useful metric, but not the only metric of the caliber of climate finance provided by individual countries. A lot of these countries here, you can see, they actually provide almost all of their bilateral climate finance as grants. Where they do provide loans, they're clearly being careful not to make it add to developing countries' existing debt burdens too much, where those are already severe. Next slide, please. So adequate, there's lots of things that are encompassed in that term, including things like predictability and reliability. But we wanted to shine a spotlight on the proportion of a country's climate finance that goes to particularly vulnerable countries. It's difficult to say what the right volume is because no one thinks 100% should go to these countries, but we do want to call out those that are really concentrating their efforts there. At the forefront on this are Australia, Iceland, Ireland, and Italy. And I think Australia and New Zealand are particularly striking because such a large share goes to SIDS, which obviously reflects their Pacific location, whereas most countries really are predominantly channeled to the least developed countries, which of course do have a much larger population. So this is just some food for thought when thinking about the allocation of loss and damage finance, adaptation finance, and to a lesser extent, mitigation finance going forward, and the shares reaching these most vulnerable communities on the real front lines. Next slide, please. Now, I mentioned before that developed countries not only have a fair share. Can you please mute yourself, please? Thanks so much. Developed countries not only have a climate finance target and the fair share quota as analysed by ODI, but they also have a ODA target, which is 0.7% of GNI. And really, they should be meeting both of these. Otherwise, you have the risk of rebadging or reallocation from one or the other, depending on what's politically popular on the day. And so I want to give a real shout out to Germany, Luxembourg, and Norway, which are the only 3 countries that meet both of these targets. Although a couple of others, particularly Denmark, Ireland, and Sweden, come close as well. My final slide concerns the extent to which, next slide, please, thank you. My final slide concerns the extent to which climate finance is also used in a way that supports gender equality. This is actually one of the core principles of the climate finance architecture as threshed out in the Paris Agreement and subsequent decision text, that climate finance should be gender responsive. And you'll see here that most countries have taken that mandate seriously. So the yellow bars indicate the share of bilateral climate finance that is also tagged with a gender tag in the OECD database. And you'll see that the blue is for your wider aid provision, which includes, but is not limited to, climate finance. So it might include humanitarian or transport infrastructure, economic development assistance, and the like. Most countries have got a greater proportion of their climate finance be mainstreaming gender or addressing gender as well than they do in their aid budgets, which we hope shows that those countries have taken seriously the guidance from the Paris Agreement. There's a couple of outliers here. And they would have a different argument. So, for example, the UK would say that it's very good at gender mainstreaming across its whole aid portfolio. And that is why climate finance is not distinctly different from climate finance, the proportion of finance supporting gender equality is not that difference between the two. In other countries, the difference is really stark. So you'll see in the US, climate finance is around 3 times more likely to be considering gender than in the rest of the country's former aid budget, obviously that now being a thing of the past. And so the main message I want you to take away from here is 2023 was really a high point in the volume of aid. And since then, we've seen a kind of collapse in the total volume of finances provided, and we're not seeing huge prospects for that to recover anytime soon with current geopolitics and associated fiscal constraints. Most countries are doing well at some aspect of their climate finance provision, and most countries have room for improvement. And so the real thing to take away is to have a nuanced look at your country or your region and the opportunities for better increased quantity or improved quality there. Thank you so much again to Climate Resilience Alliance for organising this, and to all of you for being part of it. Looking forward to hearing your comments and questions.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. You did an excellent job of covering a lot of detail very, very clearly. So please do take a second to digest what Sarah's just talked about and begin to think about your questions and pop those in the Q&A tab. Okay, but before we get to the discussion base, we have 3 more additional kind of short, sharp inputs from a really rich range of speakers. And next up, we are hearing from Dr. Ben Abraham, who's a senior consultant with the Talanola Institute. So Ben, I'd like to invite you to take the floor and offer your reflections on the set of outcomes and opportunities that Belém offers to help scale up adaptation finance. So over to you for 5 minutes.
Great, thanks very much. And thanks so much to the Climate Resilience Alliance and ODI for inviting me and putting on this great webinar, and Sarah, an excellent presentation to get us started with a real deep dive there, and happy to continue with the Oceania accents. So one of the things I think I'm going to sort of build on after Sarah's deep dive is to kind of zoom out a little bit to look at COP30 and all of the opportunities that exist at COP30 to make progress in adaptation finance. Because one of the things that I think has been a positive development this year is a more sophisticated overall understanding of the challenges and opportunities for financing adaptation and the different roles of different kinds of finance in different contexts. You know, whether it's the critical role of international public finance and grant-based finance and SIDS and LDCs in particular, to the opportunities for private sector finance in certain sectors and contexts as well, how domestic resource allocation can help unlock this and also make sure investments are aligned with adaptation. And so over the course of this year, I think I've seen sort of progress towards this more kind of robust and comprehensive understanding. And if we just go into the next slide, I'm going to begin to sort of say how actually I think COP30, although we're in a time of many challenges, as Sarah began to allude to, actually COP30 offers a lot of opportunities across the board, inside and outside of the negotiations, to make some real progress in adaptation finance. So we jump to the next slide as well. So of the challenges, we've heard about the kind of, as Sarah mentioned, some of the ODA cuts that have been announced that will begin to show up in data in the coming years, which often will flow into climate finance as well. We know that the new collective quantified goal on climate finance negotiated next year has kind of limited strong incentives for adaptation finance, and that those negotiations were really difficult and took a toll on the negotiation body. And we also know that the kind of doubling of adaptation finance that was sort of urged at COP21 is also coming to an end this year. So a lot of challenges, but hopefully you can see that my list of opportunities is longer than the list of challenges. And so in the next kind of couple minutes, I'm just going to sort of run through these and highlight how actually of all the kind of COPs in a while, there's actually a surprising number of processes and opportunities that are coming to a head in Belém and create a really kind of wide raft of opportunities to make progress. And so this is the list there. And if we go to the next slide, I'll just run through them one by one. So the first big opportunity is that the national climate finance pledges of developed countries are due to be renewed. Most countries made pledges at 2021 and they expire in 2025 and are due to be renewed. So as well as, you know, raising the the focus on that these pledges do need to be renewed so that you match up the global targets with national commitments. There's a chance to make those commitments better in terms of quality by baking adaptation subcomponents into those national pledges and beginning to normalize that for the future. So that's one of the big opportunities this year. We've obviously got the GGA indicators, the Global Goal and Adaptation, which are looking at ways to further bring attention to and the tracking of adaptation finance flows in the context of that goal. Another big one is the decision on Article 2.1c. So this is the Paris Agreement's goal of aligning finance flows with low emissions and climate resilient development. And there's going to be a decision this year really setting the forward work on that agenda. And it's one where there's been less focus on adaptation in the past. There's been more focus on aligning investments with mitigation goals and a real chance to bake adaptation into that future work. There's also a big decision to be made this year in negotiations regarding the Adaptation Fund to negotiate the process so that it transfers to serving the Paris Agreement and therefore can receive the shares of proceeds from Article 6. And so that as carbon markets now are beginning to sort of take off under the Paris Agreement, their shares of proceeds can flow to the Adaptation Fund and help that fund reach its full potential in terms of its resource mobilization. There's obviously the Baku to Belém Roadmap as well, which has had a lot of attention this year and a chance to really embed adaptation into the narrative for the next 10 years as efforts look to scale up to that 1.3 trillion. There's the Marrakesh Partnership, which is the kind of framework for the action agenda and non-state action under the sort of UNFCCC and linking to it. And they need to renew a new 5-year plan this year. And the last 5-year plan wasn't so strong on adaptation. And there's, again, an opportunity at COP30 to bake adaptation more deeply into that. There's also the Article 9.5 communications this year, which countries do every 2 years to report on how much finance they think they're going to provide in the coming years and to update the guidance for that this year, taking into account the NCQG and seeing that actually we need to put more incentives into that to force countries to really think hard about how are they going to massively scale up adaptation finance as per the language of the NCQG. So a chance to update that guidance as well. And so I'll leave it there. You'll see at the bottom, there's also the collective adaptation finance target. I've left that one to the side because there's been a lot of attention on that this year. It's also really important and great that it's been put on the agenda. But I think what I wanted to bring today was to highlight that actually there's a whole lot of other opportunities as well, which can collectively add up to something significant. And I think progress on these other elements would actually build the momentum that might help efforts to achieve a new collective adaptation target as well, whether it's this year or in the future. And very happy to come back to these in more detail in the Q&A as well. So thanks very much for the opportunity for a quick blast from my end.
Great, thank you. That's incredibly helpful. A really nice, concise summary there. Thank you. Okay, so let's continue our march on through. Next up, we're going to hear from Tara Daniel. Tara is a senior manager for policy with the Women's Environment Development Organisation We Do. So Tara, over to you to share perspectives on the importance of gender-responsive climate finance and how to make progress at COP30. And again, we have 5 minutes. I'll give you a 1-minute warning.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to spend just a few quick minutes talking with you about the importance of gender-responsive climate finance. And I think it's really just fundamental to recognize that everything we're talking about here today with regard to climate finance flows is improved, is enhanced, is made more effective by ensuring that we're using gender as a critical tool of analysis that helps us recognize and address power dynamics from an intersectional perspective as we're considering who needs funds, who actually has access to funds, who's receiving those funds and their quality, and how they're ultimately being deployed and monitored in service of those needs. So if climate finance is not feminist, it's not going to be effective. It's not going to be transformative. It's not going to be sustainable. We're going to have missed opportunities and efficiency gaps in meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. And we're going to ultimately not be unlocking the best ways to truly combat the climate crisis because we cannot achieve climate justice without gender justice. And so just to illustrate this a bit further, I wanted to use this framework that We Do developed and began sharing at COP last year, these 5 dimensions of feminist climate finance, so that we can connect it to the work that we've seen presented today. And so first and foremost, this idea of fair shares and fair shares of the amount of climate finance that's needed, which of course we do know now is well beyond the $100 billion goal, is critical to this feminist climate finance idea of ambitious, adequate, and appropriate finance, which is nicely parallel to what Sarah was presenting earlier in terms of the adequacy of finance. And basically, as we cannot achieve gender equality in a world that's ravaged by climate chaos, we need overall climate finance flows that are ambitious in comparison to what we currently have, that are really adequate to the scale and the depth of gender differentiated climate needs, and appropriate to deliver transformative climate action, which does speak to this quality of finance and the imperative of grant-based finance, particularly when we're talking about adaptation and loss and damage. So we need not only this gender tracking, but the overall tracking of fair shares to understand how to achieve feminist climate finance. And secondly, there's so much we can say about the inaccessibility of current climate finance, but I think within the context of tracking the gender tags on bilateral climate finance and ODA, one thing that's important is considering the complexity of navigating just the diversity of systems and approaches that are used by bilateral contributors, and how these are often just unfortunately predicated along former colonial relationships. So just to consider this data we do have at hand, and as well as the data that we want to move toward, it's important to note that these gender tags as being a principal or significant objective on a project, it's not going to equal a project being gender transformative. Though it's certainly possible a small percent of these projects are really designed with the highest standards of gender analysis, action, and targets. But the vast majority of what's been tagged here is not going to be principal, but significant. So it may be a truly secondary consideration of gender. And we might see tags where what is considered is only a really narrow or a reductive understanding of gender, such as looking at women's overall participation in a project, but not the gender differentiated needs across communities, or the specific knowledge and skills and practices that various groups can contribute to shaping and implementing and monitoring human rights-based climate projects. So we do want to recognize that there's not necessarily even coverage of gender across the pillars of climate action either. We suspect there's likely differences when we're considering adaptation and mitigation and loss and damage. And of course, as we're considering this bilateral climate finance with the significance and the imperative to have accountability and transparency, this fourth dimension with our finance flows, we also have to recognize the variation among bilateral donors and understanding and accessing their funding decision-making processes, how they might engage rights holders in determining priorities for funding, how they're ultimately accountable to the communities they're serving. And so there's also an important role here, we feel, for multilateral climate finance in setting or being capable of setting best practice when it comes to the transparency of flows and access to redress in the case of potential or realized harms. And so lastly, just to end with this quick note on finance that changes the system, which can encompass many things, but I think here it's important to talk about the support for advocacy, because we want to raise up not just the importance of not only having this fair shares data, but having this audience here today determining how you can best use it in your advocacy, or if you're a policymaker in your implementation, so that we can create a better system that is delivering for climate and gender justice. And to reinforce what Ben was highlighting, and to bring this back full circle to ambitious and adequate and appropriate climate finance, there are ways that we can also set these better directions at COP30, beginning with a strong and ambitious adaptation outcome, including meeting the resource mobilization floor of the Adaptation Fund, which actually has an intersectional gender policy, as well as continuing to emphasize the importance of gender responsive finance in the Gender Action Plan decision, and in the guidance to the operating entities of the UNFCCC financial mechanism, among others. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tara. Excellent timekeeping from our speakers and such quality input. Really appreciated. Okay, so last up, we're going to hear from John Nordbo, who's Senior Advocacy Advisor from Climate with Care. So over to you, John, to share insight from Care's latest climate finance shadow reports. And again, I'll give you a 1-minute warning in 4 minutes' time.
Thank you, and thanks to the Alliance for inviting me to this webinar and giving me the chance to present our new shadow report. The Climate Finance Shadow Report is a co-production this year between Oxfam and CARE, whereas Oxfam has produced it for quite a number of years. And next slide, please. So our report is actually a very easy read. It contains a lot of figures and tables and boxes and so on, but a lot of data across all kinds of issues related to climate finance. I think our report is the first sort of comprehensive overview of climate finance that's based on the reporting by the developed countries in their first biannual transparency reports. Next slide, please. And I will only touch on a few issues from the report, and I only have 3 slides of substance. But what's very important is to note that loans dominate climate finance. 2/3 of all public climate finance has a form of loans. And also, if you look at adaptation finance, it's 50% of it that's loans. And even if you look at climate finance for the most vulnerable countries like the LDCs and the SIDS, then half of their climate finance is made of loans. So a core element of this finance shadow report, and that has been an element of the reports from Oxfam earlier, is a calculation of the sort of net support. If you take the grant equivalent of the loans and add it to the grants, how much is that then the true support of climate finance? That's a calculation you don't find in the official reports because they just lump together grants and loans as if it was the same. But we've been through all the loans and with the individual data on each loan and calculated the grant equivalent. So if you look at the first shadow report from Oxfam, then in 2015-16, less than half of the official climate finance was in fact support. Push the button, please. And if you look at the data from 2022, then we are in the same situation. Less than half of the claimed climate finance by developed countries is in fact sort of true support for developing countries. And push the button, please. So a new feature in our report this year is that we have calculated the payback ratio of loans. And the overall result is that for every $5 in loan, the developing countries, they have to pay back $7. And if you take into account that this is an average and that some of the loans are in fact somewhat friendly with lower interest rates and a nice payback time and so on, then you'll see that in fact there will be a lot of loans that give quite a return to the global north instead of really being support for the global south. Next slide, please. So when the countries met at COP29 last year, there was quite some optimism that the goal of doubling adaptation finance in 2025 would be met. And countries, they looked at at data like the red bars here, and you could get the impression that the $38 billion goal was sort of in sight. But what we've seen since then, and what wasn't really taken into account last year, that some countries, they began to cut their ODA, and we've seen a lot of more cuts this year. So if you take that into account, then we are actually in a situation where the adaptation finance goal might not be met. Next slide, please. So in our report, we have a lot of information about individual countries and how they do on different fronts when it comes to climate finance. And if, for example, you look at the grant share, then we have countries, and there are really big differences in quality of climate finance. If you look at the grant share, then France and Japan, they have respectively 5 and 13% grant shares, whereas we really have a number of countries doing 100% grants like Denmark, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. And push the button, please. If you look at adaptation share, then you also have some laggards like Spain and Norway with only 9 and 12% adaptation share, and some other countries doing considerably better, Switzerland and Australia. I think it's very important to take this into account. Also, if you look at the sort of scorecard that ODI presented early on, where you could see, for example, that France, Japan, and Norway, they've got sort of the dark green, ended up in the dark green box, but that's really related to the low level of grants and the low level of adaptation in their climate finance, as Sarah also mentioned. So that was a sort of very brief introduction to our report. Next slide. I'm happy to take any questions, and I would of course also appreciate any feedback on our report, and I think we will provide the link to the report in the chat. Over.
Great, thank you so much, John. And please do make sure that we get the link to your report in the chat. I know lots of people will be asking for that. Okay, so we have had some really rich snapshots there, and we already have a set of great questions under our Q&A tab. For those who haven't seen my message in the chat, I would encourage you to go to the Q&A tab and have a look at those questions. Use the little arrow beneath each of the questions to upvote if you're also interested. That just helps me prioritize the questions that, you know, a number of people are most interested in. So we're going to start with Anna Renfrew's question. Anna asks, what appetite is there for a new commitment on adaptation finance? And how realistic do you think it is for COP this year? So I'd like to encourage fairly brief responses from our panelists, and please raise your hand, your team's hand, panelists, if you'd like to respond to this question or any of the others, so I know who to call on. Who's going to take this one? Or I might volunteer you. Oh, great. John, over to you.
Thank you. I think that's a very important question. I'm not sure the appetite among the developed countries is big for any sort of progress on climate finance. But on the other hand, I think it's also very clear that there is a need for a new target. We're still not in a situation where adaptation makes up more than a third of climate finance. And we are, as I showed, in a situation where it's really debatable or uncertain if even the modest 2025 target will be met. So there is a need for such a target, and yeah, there are groups out there, including the LDCs, fighting for it, and I really hope that they will succeed.
Great, thank you so much. And as we go through the questions, oh, great, do join us, Ben. We'll get your input on that just now.
Yeah, happy to add on to John's really good answer. And I think, I would agree that, it depends who you ask. There's obviously a large appetite from some of the developing country groups asking for it. But I think, as John said, the appetite from most of the developed countries, I think, is extremely low. And I think this year it's just a particularly tough time where the winds are blowing in the opposite direction for many of those countries, having just used up a lot of capital and political capital domestically on the NCQG, with some cuts having been announced. So I think it's very tough for that collective signal, and there's lots of kind of concerns around sort of reopening the NCQG by renegotiating. It's something that was discussed last time. But I think the opportunity to continue to advocate for it is there and important. And you can see that the Glasgow doubling, for example, wasn't sort of framed as a, this is agreeing a new goal, but it was, a language that was sort of urging particular action. And so there's opportunities to look at that and consider the framing to find ways that might make it sit alongside the NCQG nicely without reopening those negotiations. And, even if it doesn't happen now, there's an opportunity to also take decisions at COP30 that could lay a pathway for negotiations in a couple of years to then come back to it, say, perhaps once there's official data on the 2025 doubling at the end, you could sort of set up a negotiation in a couple of years' time if one couldn't be landed this year. So all the reason to push for it and negotiate for it. But it is a challenging time, but even still there's options and different types of scenarios that I think can still represent progress.
Great, thank you so much for those two perspectives. We'll move on to the next question, which I'm going to take in a moment, Sarah, which is going to be for you. It's a question posed by Tom. Before I do that, I'm just aware that online we have so many people with such rich experience. So if you see any of these questions and you think, oh, I wish I could talk, please, if you can, note your thoughts in the chat. You can join in the conversation that way. If you've got a view on any of these questions, just jot those views down in the chat if you'd like to. Okay, so on to Tom's question, which is a really popular one. Tom says, Sarah, your headline analysis seems to have been done entirely in terms of the brackets radically inadequate 100 billion figure. This is interesting, but a fair share of an unfair figure is not fair. Have you considered doing another analysis in terms of need? So over to you, Sarah, for your thoughts on that.
Thanks so much, Tom. It's a good question, and let me provide a couple of different answers to it. So the first one is there's a few variations on our report, right? There's the Oxfam and Concern Shadow reports, WRI and CGDev have done these kinds of analyses and so on. And they play slightly different roles in the ecosystem in terms of who they try and influence and how. So ours was one of the first ones out, and to be honest, at that point we didn't think of doing something like grant equivalence or a need-based figure because it was back in 2021 and we were kind of looking towards hitting the 2020 deadline at all. But with hindsight, I think there's one of the roles that our analysis plays in the ecosystem is that it's very valuable to have an analysis that is actually done on developed countries' own terms. Whether or not you agree with those terms, and there's a lot of reason to challenge and critique them, and we have other work that does just that, it's very useful to lay out that even using the sort of minimal standards set out in terms of reporting and concessionality and so on, that a bunch of countries have missed the target for multiple years in a row, and lots of countries that package themselves as climate leaders as well. So that we find is sort of a very useful critique to have out there in the ecosystem. And the second point I would make is that sometimes countries do fall short in different ways, but are not doing so. They're doing so with the best of intentions. There is a lot of, every country can be criticized for some aspect of its climate finance. Like I said, Norway's providing 3 times its fair share. It's mostly doing so in the form of grants, et cetera, but it's paid for by oil. There's always a stick to beat them with. So I think it's really important to show where countries are approaching the goal with good intentions on quantity, ideally with decent quality as well, and enable progressive coalitions, because the current developing country divide that's so starkly playing out in the negotiations is not delivering sufficient ambition. Whereas the alliances that have always yielded, the 1.5 degree goal, the loss and damage fund, are alliances between well-intended, if imperfect, developed countries and developed country blocs like the European Union, with the alliance of small island states or the least developed countries, are driving progress. So I think that differentiation is really important in that way. My last answer is just to say, if we look instead at the independent high-level expert group on climate finance and their analysis of how much international public finance you need in the system by 2030, from the developed country bucket, excluding South-South cooperation, they're talking about 400 to 520 billion a year by 2030 of both development assistance and climate finance. And so if you just want to use our fair share metric, you can take the percentages and apply them to that figure. So they should be doing between 2 and 2.5 times what they are. So a couple of countries are meeting it, a couple are meeting it through loans, but you obviously have a lot more that would be in the yellow and orange space if you were to use that number. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks for those thoughts, Sarah. Next, we're going to go to Shavkat's question, and after that, just I guess a heads up for you, Tara, I think we will perhaps go to Felicity's question, which asks, which is a really important question about representation, so maybe you could have a look at that one in a minute. But let's go to Shavkat's question first, which says, considering Pakistan's high vulnerability to climate change, despite contributing less than 1% to global carbon emissions, why is the country not receiving a fair and equitable share of climate finance that prioritises inclusive adaptive measures such as flood-resilient infrastructure, especially given the escalating climate hazards it faces each year, including the 2025 floods? And then Felicity seconds that for Madagascar. So it's around, this question about which countries are prioritised. I wonder if the panel have any kind of points that they could, or reflections they could offer on that. If anyone wants to pop your hand up. John.
So I guess the sort of simple answer to that question is that developed countries, they really like to provide climate finance for green transition, renewable energies and so on. And they are not that keen on providing climate finance for neither adaptation nor loss and damage. So it's a tough battle for the vulnerable countries to make sure that their needs are taken into account and not just the needs for sort of support in fighting climate change that's sort of dominating the perspective on climate finance and what to support from the global north. And of course, it's also linked to the issue that the global north nowadays, they want to or prioritize to give climate finance as loans, so there's a payback, and that's much more easy when it comes to renewable energy projects and so on. So unfortunately, there's no sort of needs-based approach to climate finance from the global north. It's something that we all need to fight for. And I think it's also something that if you read the latest, the advisory opinion that came from the International Court of Justice this summer, then you would have a clear legal argument for demanding climate finance that's associated with the needs and not just what Global North want to provide.
Great. Thank you, John. Shavkat, I wonder if you would like to come on screen. I know you yourself have been a close observer of COP processes, and I wonder if you have a view around why countries like Pakistan are not receiving the fair share. If there's anything you would like to add. If not at this stage, no problem. If you would like to, please take a minute of time to do that and unmute yourself. I'll give you a second to ponder that. I can't see all the participants on my screen, so you'll have to speak up if you do want to.
Yeah, I can speak on this, my question. Pakistan is like one of the vulnerable countries, and we are facing these climate shocks each and every year. And the vulnerability is raising every year. We are facing like different types of climate hazards, like one we faced in 2025, and each year, like now it's a regular phenomena, but the fair share in terms of climate finances is not coming to the country Pakistan, whether that is in form of loss and damages. The vulnerabilities are like raising more. We just faced the floods, and now we are just waiting, like from the month of April, that there will be a heat wave. Another hazard will come, and after that, then again there will be monsoons. And so, I mean, this is a good opportunity. The COP30. So there should be like some advocacy for countries like Pakistan and other countries as well, where there are vulnerability due to climate hazards, where the contribution is much more less, but we are facing the burden of other developed countries. So there should be like a fair finances, a climate finances for adaptation, and that should be inclusive as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Shafqat, and thank you for sharing that experience from Pakistan. We really appreciate it. Okay, Tara, this is going to be, I think, perhaps one of our last questions, and a really, really crucial one from Felicity. How can we ensure changes to who is in the room, especially at COP and even in webinars like today, to ensure perspectives and expertise from those countries most impacted by climate change are heard? So I think I'll stop there at that kind of initial question. There's a longer set of questions, and I'm sure you've read, and I'm more than welcome to address some of those as well. But let's start there. Over to you.
I am so sorry. I am actually not able to access the questions and answers, so I've not read those additional questions. But if you'll pop those in the chat, I'll go ahead and start on the
I
first
will
one.
do that just now. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for letting me know. I shall do that.
Yeah, so I think this is this crucial question of who is in the room so that we can create more just policies and that we can really draw from a variety of experiences, of lived experience, and a variety of methodologies. I think one thing that's important to point out, especially as a representative of the women and gender constituency, which is where we do deserts coordination for UNFCCC advocacy, is that there's a long history of feminist scholarship and feminist methodologies. So bringing to the table gender disaggregated data, methodologies such as feminist participatory action research, these are things that should be considered and ultimately enhancing the decision-making that's happening. Now, of course, what we know instead is that often who is in the room, it does tend to still be predominantly male. That at COP, women's participation among party delegates has really stagnated at around 35% for the past several years. But that's not to say, of course, it is a necessary but not sufficient condition for us to have better representation, not just of women, but of women and girls in their full diversity, considering all of the identities that people are bringing, to ensure that we not only have that representation, but that we also have, as I was saying, that experience, that expertise, that data, and that knowledge that can inform the types of policies that should be made, and recognizing that gender is an area of expertise. And so having more women in the room is important, but we still have to have that gender expertise in the room. And so as we are thinking about how we can do this better decision making that's more inclusive and that's ultimately going to be designing more effective policies, I think it is important that we are looking at the ways in which parties are coordinating and drawing from the experiences of civil society, of academia prior to coming to the negotiations, and then also being able to support and heed the observers that are participating and the experiences that they're bringing, which is often a very technical expertise for those that have been engaging in these negotiations for many years. And I'm just checking the chat for the rest of those, that question,
Thank
and
you so much.
appreciating, this idea on, rethinking and reimagining, because I think that is going to be crucial to move to new and more effective models.
Great. Thank you so much, Tara. I think you've done a great job of kind of responding to that really important challenge. I think we're going to squeeze in one more question, especially since this one has 3 upvotes. I'm also going to post it in the chat so Tara and anyone else who can't access the Q&A can see it. So the question is, as someone mentioned, one of the issues with climate finance is that countries may tag some financial support as being adaptation or mitigation finance, but the real climate relevance of the project may be extremely limited, for example, in large infrastructure projects. What's a better way of accounting for the real climate impact of the financial support provided so that figures are not inflated? Sarah, over to you.
Thanks, Anna. You're right. I have some thoughts. Thanks so much for that question, Matteo, and nice to see you here. I don't have a solution to the reporting problem. We already have 2 reporting systems with the biennial transparency reports and the OECD creditor reporting system. So I'm not going to encourage a 3rd one, and I'm not going to encourage people to divert the next 10 years of their life into negotiating what a marginal improvement would look like. What I wanted to say instead was that we have seen huge improvements in the quality of reporting thanks to campaigning and advocacy efforts by NGOs all over the world. So, for example, Japan used to routinely report coal-fired power plants as part of its mitigation finance because it was using newer technology than it might have 10 years beforehand. And so it counted it towards a lower carbon development path. And sustained international pressure really has helped move it. It's still not amazing, don't get me wrong, but it's definitely better than it was. And the same has played out in how countries claim the significant tag. So climate finance can be tagged as principal or significant. And if it was significant, some countries still used to count 100% of that towards their climate finance goal, and they stopped because of that public criticism in UNFCCC and in the national context. So there's a lot of NGOs out there doing this globally and doing it at the national level. So I know ECHO in Italy, for example, there's lots of problems there with claiming diesel generators and the like as a low carbon solution. And I just want to really encourage more of that close attention to the projects that countries are claiming as mitigation or adaptation, because it does move the needle over the course of 2 or 3 years and makes a real difference in the quality of the climate finance.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. And I'm afraid we're rapidly approaching time, so John, I won't come to you in this case. So apologies. I want to make sure we respect everyone's time and finish on time. Also, thanks to those of you who posed questions that we weren't able to respond to just now. It's really helpful for us to know, as an alliance, to know what people are interested in, what your key questions are on these topics, so we can build those into future planning for future events. So rest assured, we've seen your questions. I'm very happy to also follow up via email if you would like to reach out to any member of the Climate Resilience Alliance. And yes, I will put my email in the chat as requested. But for now, massive thank you to our speakers. It's a tall ask to just, present such rich information in such short space of time and then have loads of questions fired at you. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again to Salome for organising us all, making this happen, and to everybody that's taken the time out of your days to join us. It's been a really interesting and worthwhile hour from my perspective. So thank you for being part of the conversation. Keep in touch with us. And yeah, great to see you all. Thanks again.